Over the years, the word creepypasta has gone from something obscure seen on various forums to becoming something bigger than what anyone could have ever imagined. Stories like Slenderman, The Rake, Smile Dog, Ben Drowned, and many, many more have struck fear in the hearts of millions. Certain creepypastas are of course bigger than others, and for various reasons. And then, there are those that, despite being great stories, don't really get the attention they deserve. So today, I thought I'd share the ones that I personally find to be overlooked or forgotten about, but which I believe should be brought up more often. Keep in mind that this isn't necessarily a list of the scariest creepypastas, but simply those that I believe deserve more recognition. I will also not describe these stories in great detail, as I believe you should go read them for yourself if you haven't already. So without further ado, let's begin. No End House. After hearing about a supposedly haunted house from one of his friends, the author of the story decides to visit the so-called No End House. Allegedly, if the guest visiting the house makes it through the hotel's 9 rooms, they would be awarded with a $500 cash prize. The author, who is very skeptical, decides to enter. The lobby itself was laughable, with cheap Halloween items decorating it. There was no staff present, and the author decided to enter the first room through a door labeled with a big number 1. The first few rooms were ridiculously tame, but the further the author proceeds into the house, the darker and more morbid cracks of the secret inside the house starts to show. The rooms grow gradually worse and worse, and pushes the physical and mental limitations of the author. Now, if you haven't read the story yet, I won't spoil the brilliant ending for you. This story is, to be honest, fairly known, but I'm surprised it's not brought up more often. I myself hadn't even heard of this story until quite recently, and therefore, it deserves the number 10 spot. The showers. We all have that one teacher who is much cooler than all the others. A good example of that is Mr. Mays from this certain story. On Halloween night, many years ago, Mr. Mays gathered the author's class and explained that Halloween was his favorite time of the year, and decides to share one of his most frightening memories from his younger years. Back in the day, when Mays was much younger, he and a couple of friends were in Broken Bow, Nebraska, exploring the countryside. They soon found the entrance to what seemed to be an old abandoned cellar near a barn, and when they entered, they were greeted with a long, uneven tunnel with numerous light bulbs illuminating the way. What they found in there was truly terrifying. Years later, the author, Jack, decides to seek out this mysterious cave, together with his friend Steve. They soon find themselves in an area very similar to what Mr. Mays had described so many years ago. After inspecting the interior of the barn, Jack soon falls through the floor and is separated from Steve. When he regains consciousness, he finds himself in a dark cave. When Steve goes to get the rope from the car to pull Jack up, Jack is put in a hell so terrifying he nearly goes insane. And what does he see? Read the story to find out. What you don't see. Have you ever wondered to yourself what people look like or what they do when you aren't around them or you don't see them? Kind of like when you're not looking and a friend comes up from behind and gives you bunny ears or makes faces over your shoulder. When you leave your grandparents' house, have you ever wondered what they do, how they act? You're in your kitchen and your mom is at the table. You open the refrigerator and you don't see the face of your own mother. Do you ever wonder what happens to that face? If it gets morphed before you go back to look at it? Could that possibly ever happen? Of course, we just think to ourselves that couldn't happen, that would be stupid. But the chances that someone, or something, is coming from behind you, or even staring at you while you're alone, are plenty higher. We just have to sit by ourselves and hope that whoever or whatever is out there doesn't try to hurt us. Just make sure to watch your back. Chatroom 98. When the author searches through his attic, he finds an old red box containing a CD labeled Chatroom 98. The disc contained what seemed to be nothing more but any other generic chatbot program. But after chatting with the bot for some time, the conversation turns much more sinister. The author is actually speaking to a man from the 1800s by the name of Darwin Clark, who hints at the fact that he brutally murdered his two sisters. Clark soon tells the author to look behind him, and when he does, nothing was there. When looking back at the monitor, though, he sees a pale, white man grinning at him with crimson red eyes. The author jumped at this and fell unconscious. When he wakes up, he's in the hospital. He knew he had to share his story. The Spongebob bootleg episode. This image was taken from a split-second frame in a corrupted bootleg of the Spongebob episode Dumped. Other than this image, the rest of the video is comprised of incomprehensible jumbles of colors, static, and black screens. The audio seems to be a heavily distorted version of the audio from the original episode, with loud, droning buzzes occasionally interrupting it. The bootleg tape itself was found by 5 urban exploring teenagers in a trash can within an abandoned mental institution. Of these 5 individuals, 2 have committed suicide, 1 has gone missing, another refuses to comment on the tape, and the last hastily agreed to give paranormal investigators the tape shortly after being interviewed about the suicide and the disappearances of the 3 other people. The current whereabouts of the tape are unknown, and many who stare at this image for a long enough period of time claim to see SpongeBob blink. Stairs. There once lived an elderly woman in a 2-story house. She was completely immobile and required the help of a carer to perform her daily duties, as her husband had died years ago. The house she lived in had a long flight of stairs that led to the 2nd floor, and the carer had to carry her up the stairs like an infant. One day, the police received a call from the woman, who told them a murder had taken place. Since the perpetrator had escaped, only 1 policeman was sent to her house to investigate. When he arrived, the carer's corpse was lying on the 1st floor, and the old woman was sitting in her wheelchair at the top of the stairs, on the second floor, with a shocked expression. The policeman investigated the first floor, and soon decided to investigate the second floor, just to be sure no stone was unturned. The lady reluctantly agreed, and the policeman searched every room. He grew more and more leery, and searched every corner, every drawer, every detail. When he entered the last room, the bedroom, he froze, and was frightened, not by what was in there, but what wasn't. There was no phone anywhere on the second floor. The man turned around and ran back into the hallway. The old lady was not in the wheelchair anymore. Pokemon, Come Follow Me. Following the increased numbers of suicides of youths in Japan due to Pokemon Red and Green, a team of detectives were set out to conclude just why children decided to take their lives after playing the games. The deeper the detectives dug in the case, the worse it got. They were soon directed to Sosuke Tamada, who had worked on the games, and while interrogating the intimidating man, the detectives found out Sosuke had manipulated numerous of the game's designers. Sosuke wanted to add something in the game that wouldn't just revolutionize the gaming industry, but the world as a whole. He told the detectives that if they were so determined on finishing the case, why not play the game themselves? He then swiftly killed himself. The main perpetrator was now dead, and the case was put to rest. 10 years later, in 2006, one of the only detectives left decided to finally try to play one of the confiscated cartridges from one of the children who had killed themselves. Starting a new game, everything was normal. But when he entered the tall grass, the game froze and faded to black. And what happened next? Read the story to find out. Spongebob, Hope is Lost. Heavily inspired by Squidward's suicide, this story tells us of a Nickelodeon intern who witnesses a morbid SpongeBob episode. When working there, he usually got to watch and reflect on episodes of SpongeBob before they aired on television. One day, when he got to work, no one was in the editing room, and when the intern entered, the door slammed shut behind him. Figuring this was some sort of joke by his work partners, he sat down on a chair in front of him and opened a laptop that stood before him. He saw that a blank disc was in the CD tray, and when inserting the disc, a video opened without prompting. The video was a strange episode of SpongeBob that began with SpongeBob snoring in his bed for over 3 minutes, before slowly zooming in on his face. His face had an expression of horror and malice, as if he was having a terrible nightmare. His eyes also seemed to have been almost stitched shut. The scene then transitioned into what seemed to be SpongeBob's mind. The sky of Bikini Bottom had turned blood red, and all buildings were destroyed and burning. SpongeBob was simply walking down the road while people around him could be heard screaming in pain and agony. When SpongeBob turned the corner, the source of the screams were revealed. It was Patrick, crucified, with his entrails hanging out of his stomach. When he saw SpongeBob, he seemed relieved, but SpongeBob simply stood there and watched his friend suffer. Patrick soon began to weep, as if he understood something that the viewer did not. SpongeBob then spoke.
Suffer, fat one. You this whole town brought this upon themselves.
He then turned around and left his friend to die. Spongebob began approaching the Krusty Krab until he stopped as he heard something behind him. It was Patrick, who had ripped himself off the cross with huge holes in his hands and his entire lower body missing, was crawling towards Spongebob, begging him to kill him to end his misery. Spongebob showed no mercy. He then made it to the Krusty Krab, and the path that usually led there was decorated with stakes with the corpses of familiar characters such as Sandy, Mr. Krabs, Squidward, and many more hammered into them. SpongeBob now stood alone in the Krusty Krab. SpongeBob approached the door that led to the kitchen and slowly turned the knob. The door flung open, revealing a hellish demon. The devil referred to SpongeBob as his son and told him to return to his cage. Something began to emerge from SpongeBob, and his body slowly deflated into... It almost seemed to be a human or a dog. It was undescribable. It slowly crawled into the kitchen, and the demon kicked him into what seemed to be a gateway into hell itself. After the episode ended, the computer shut itself off and burst into flames. The author, Nick, fainted as a result. When he woke up, after his work partner Tina woke him up, his sanity had snapped, and he now saw himself as a chosen slayer for our world. His first victim was poor Tina, and he assures the reader that no one is safe. Now, despite the story taking a rather odd turn in the last segment, the story itself is very creepy and deals with such subjects as hells and demons, and the story has a very religious feel to it at times. You also feel very empty when SpongeBob is walking alone in Bikini Bottom and all of his friends, all these familiar faces, are dead and crucified. Therefore, I believe the story deserves some better recognition. Annie 96 is typing. Written as a dialogue in a chat room, this story feels very believable, as it uses many current-day slangs and common traits usually seen in current chat rooms, making it feel up-to-date and recent. The story details two teenagers, Davy and Annie, playfully chatting. Annie soon starts complaining about strange noises in her garden, and when she goes to look, she is horrified. In her garden stands what appears to be Davy, crawling on all fours, digging in her plants. It looks up at her and smiles the most horrifying smile before slowly starting to approach her house. Davy assures Annie that he is in fact not in her garden and tells her to call the police and hide in her closet. As Annie and Davy wait for the police to arrive, they both share playful banter with each other, hinting at their true feelings for each other. Soon, Annie tells Davy that everything is fine, and that the strange man, or thing, had left. Davy is relieved to hear it, until he realizes that whoever is talking to him through the chat room might not be Annie at all. When confronting the sender about it, Annie's account goes offline. Now, I was very impressed with this story. It manages to get its scares across, create relatable and likable characters, and add a lot of personality in a very short time span. And the story is not very long at all. Now, look at the Creepypasta wiki. 11 comments. Freaking inexcusable. This story is amazing, and more people really need to read it. If you haven't already, please go do that right now, or after the video's finished. And at last, number 1. Now this one is one of my favorite creepypastas of all time. It's exceptionally well written, described, and based in reality. It does what many creepypastas fail to do nowadays. Actually creep me out. I absolutely love this story, and the fact that it's not brought up more often when pastas like Jeff the Killer, Sonic.exe, and Tailstall receive so much attention really irks me. Therefore, my number one pick is the Harbinger experiment. The Harbinger experiment was a radical experiment conducted by a scientist nicknamed Zimmerman by the author. The author was contacted by Zimmerman, who knew he was in dire need of employment. When the author saw the payout, he immediately jumped at the opportunity. 15 were hired in total. Some were old colleagues of Zimmerman, some were maintenance workers, and some were hired as private security. The author is still uncertain as to how Zimmerman was able to fund the experiment, and suspected it was not entirely legal. Deep in the frozen wilderness of Alaska, the experiment began underground. The interior design was confusing, almost maze-like, and the only exit to the structure was an incredibly thick metal lid up a long ladder. Bringing in 3 test subjects, who had all been lured into the experiment with the promises of only participating in a harmless study of isolation, sealed in 3 separate cells, the 3 subjects believed they would simply be observed harmlessly. They could not have been more wrong. While monitoring the subjects, Zimmerman began chanting something in what sounded like an otherworldly language. Everyone in the building started experiencing a feeling of dread, and the cameras in all 3 cells started showing nothing but static, as the screams of the subjects in pain and agony could be heard filling the isolated halls. An hour later, the screams finally stopped, yet the cameras were still malfunctioning. The following morning, when the scientists returned, an ominous presence was felt inside the entire structure. When entering the control room, 2 of the 3 monitors showed nothing but static. The only one not showing static showed one of the subjects lying perfectly still in her cell, stone dead. Soon enough, the 3rd monitor's image returned. On screen was a creature, a humanoid, standing in the middle of the room, completely still, and doing nothing but simply staring straight into the camera with its black, soul-piercing eyes. Its skin was completely smooth and hairless, and its limbs were especially long, as its arms hung almost as low as its knees. As the security team went to check on the other unmonitored cell, the creature inside put up a fierce fight and had to be shot with nearly a dozen magazines before it dropped dead. The creature managed to kill one of the guards and seriously damage another with its long, sharp claws. After a while, a song could be heard, becoming increasingly louder and louder until it was almost unbearable. The song was Living in the Sunlight by Tiny Tim. Then, the power went out, and when it came back, the monitor showed that the creature had escaped its cell. It then appeared in the control room. It stopped, glanced over at Zimmerman, the man who had brought it into existence. It then ran up to him and ripped the man in half. It then went on a rampage, murdering everyone that stood in its way. The author ran for his life and went up the ladder. He knew what he had to do. And so, he sealed the lid, dooming his fellow co-workers, but saving the world from whatever Zimmerman had given birth to. Or so he thought. The author ends the story by telling us of why he decided to share his story with the world, as he is basically the only one left with the knowledge of the experiment. He could hear Living in the Sunlight outside his house. It had found him. And with that, I conclude my personal picks for the most underrated creepypastas in my eyes. What creepypastas do you believe deserve better recognition? Please share it in the comments below. Also, I would like to thank you all for watching this video, and thank you all so much for 25,000 subscribers. That's just incredible. I thank you all from the bottom of my heart. Also, I'm gonna be doing a Q&A. If you have a question for me, write a comment that begins with QA followed by your question, and I'll answer it. And for those who have already posted their questions in my other video, don't worry, I'll include them too. And stay tuned, I will finally show my face! Again, thank you so much for watching, and take care. Stay awesome, everyone.